He awoke to the scent of ash and rain. The ground beneath him was cold, wet with dew, and the sky above burned with a light he had never seen before. His name was Cale, or at least it had been. Once, long ago, he had been a swordsman who fought on battlefields that stretched beyond memory. He had killed kings, led armies, and died more times than he could remember. Yet somehow, his story refused to end. When Cale opened his eyes this time, the world was new. The trees were taller, the mountains sharper, and the air carried the sweetness of a forgotten spring. He looked into a nearby pool and saw a reflection that wasn't his, a younger face, unscarred, untouched by the wars he remembered. Only his eyes remained the same, dark, silent, burdened with centuries of battle. He whispered to the wind that surrounded him, "So the gods have cursed me to walk again. Then let this world test my blade once more." Cale wandered for days across lands that seemed torn from a forgotten legend. Castles of stone rose above valleys wrapped in mist. Soldiers in shining armor trained beneath banners marked with a phoenix. The people spoke of war, of something coming from the north, a shadow that devoured whole villages. But Cale was not interested in their politics. All he wanted was a sword. He entered the shining city of Eldoria, where the streets were paved with marble and the smell of roasted bread mixed with the clang of steel. He moved through crowds unnoticed, a ghost among the living. On a public board, a parchment flapped in the wind. By decree of His Majesty, King Alden of Eldoria, the royal princess seeks a master of the sword to instruct her in the art of war. Payment, 10 gold bars. Honor, eternal. Cale's eyes narrowed. A princess in need of a swordmaster. Perhaps fate was mocking him. Perhaps it was offering redemption. He presented himself before the royal guards and was led into a hall of gold and glass. King Alden sat upon his throne, a man of pride and sorrow. When the king asked for his name, Cale simply replied, "Cale." Nothing more. His tone carried no arrogance, only certainty. The king studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "You will meet my daughter. If she deems you worthy, you may stay." The great doors opened, and she entered, Princess Elise. Her armor gleamed like morning frost, her golden hair tied in a single braid that framed her youthful face. But her eyes burned with defiance. She was no fragile royal. She was someone desperate to prove herself. When she looked at Cale, her first words were a challenge. "You're the new swordmaster." "If the king wills it," Cale said calmly. "You don't look like one," she replied. "Nor do you look like someone who can hold a sword," he answered without hesitation. The court fell silent. Even the king smiled faintly. And in that moment, Elise's fate and his became entwined. Their first lesson took place in the courtyard. Knights gathered to watch. The princess wielded a ceremonial blade, polished to perfection, while Cale borrowed a rusted sword from a guard. She frowned at his choice, but he only said, "A true blade doesn't shine, princess. It remembers blood." She attacked first, her movements swift and elegant, but Cale saw through her immediately. She fought with form, not heart. Her strikes were beautiful, but empty. In 3 moves, he disarmed her. Her sword fell to the ground. He turned his back to her, voice calm and cutting. Lesson 1. Pride is the first thing the blade will take from you. That night, while the moon hung low over the palace, she found him again. He sat alone, sharpening his sword by the pale light. She told him he humiliated her. He told her he taught her. She said she hated him. He said hatred was a sharper teacher than kindness. When she demanded real training, he said only one thing, at dawn, "Don't be late." And she wasn't. The days that followed broke her body and rebuilt it. Cale trained her without mercy. Every morning began with bruises and ended with blood. He taught her that the sword was not a weapon, it was a mirror. It reflected fear, weakness, and truth. Pain, he told her, is the price of understanding. Slowly, she began to change. Her movements grew steadier. Her breath matched her blade. The royal court mocked her efforts at first, a princess playing soldier, but soon, they fell silent when they saw her fight. Cale rarely spoke of his past, but sometimes, his words carried the weight of ghosts. "Every blade remembers the hand that forged it," he said once as they trained beneath the rain. "Some remember love, others, regret." One evening, when thunder rolled across the sky, Elise asked, "What does your sword remember?" Cale looked at her, eyes distant. Too much. War came sooner than anyone expected. Dark riders from the north swept across the borderlands, burning villages and slaughtering farmers. The banners of Oldoria flew high, but their people trembled. The king called for his armies. Cale knew it would not be enough. He stood before the king and warned him. "She's not ready for this." "You underestimate her," the king replied. Cale's voice hardened. "No, I've seen what happens to those who aren't ready." But war didn't wait. It came with fire and steel. The enemy marched upon Oldoria's gates. The sky turned crimson, and the earth shook with the thunder of hooves. On the walls of the palace, Cale and Elise stood side by side, blades drawn. "All my life," she said, "I was told to stay behind walls." "Then it's time you learn what lies beyond them," Cale answered. When the first wave hit, Cale became death in motion. His sword cut through the enemy like wind through leaves, precise, relentless, silent. Elise fought beside him, no longer the princess who sought approval, but a warrior forged by pain and purpose. In her eyes, Cale saw the reflection of his own youth, the same fire, but uncorrupted by despair. The battle raged until the courtyard was littered with the fallen. Cale's arm was cut, his shoulder pierced, but he did not falter. When the enemy commander appeared, a towering figure in black armor shaped like bone, the air seemed to freeze. The commander's voice was like a storm. "So, you're the legendary swordmaster of Oldoria. Let's see if the stories are true." Cale stepped forward. "You'll regret seeking proof." The duel was brutal. Steel clashed, sparks flew, and each strike echoed like thunder. The commander's strength was monstrous. Cale's movement slowed. He bled, stumbled, but never stopped. Then, just as the enemy raised his blade for the final blow, a golden light cut through the smoke. Elise's sword pierced the commander's chest. For a moment, time itself paused. The commander fell, and silence descended. Cale looked at her, the girl who had once been his student, and for the first time in this new life, he smiled. "Lesson 2, he whispered. "A true sword does not serve the hand. It serves the heart." The war ended with the dawn. Oldoria stood victorious, but the price was high. In the days that followed, the people celebrated, yet Cale remained apart from them. His wounds were deep, and something inside him knew his journey was ending. He stood on the castle balcony, watching the rising sun. The light washed over the rooftops like gold spilling over stone. Elise came to him quietly. "You're leaving," she said. "I was never meant to stay," he replied. "I won't let you go." Cale turned to her, eyes soft but distant. "You already surpassed me, princess. My purpose here is done." Tears filled her eyes. "Then tell me, was I a good student?" Cale smiled faintly. "No, you were a warrior." He handed her his sword, the same old, scarred blade that had followed him through lifetimes. "Keep it. It remembers my sins and your strength." "Will I see you again?" she whispered. "Every time you draw that blade." When dawn broke, Cale was gone. No one saw him leave. Some said he became a wanderer again. Some said he vanished into legend. Only Elise knew the truth, that his spirit still lingered somewhere beyond the horizon, watching over her. Years passed. The young princess became Queen Elise, the warrior queen of Oldoria. She united the fractured lands and brought peace through strength, not conquest. But every time she unsheathed her sword, she could feel his presence, silent, guiding, eternal. The world forgot the name of the man who taught her to fight. But legends whispered of a nameless swordsman who appeared when kingdoms fell, who trained those destined to change the world, and who disappeared when his task was done. And so, as the winds carried stories of peace and ruin across the lands, his voice lingered somewhere in the echoes of memory. A blade is not forged in fire, but in purpose. And sometimes, the sharpest edge is not steel, but the will to protect another. Years passed like drifting embers fading into dusk. The world Cale had once known changed, and with every sunrise, his legend dissolved further into myth. In distant taverns, men told stories of a ghostly swordsman who appeared on battlefields, teaching lost soldiers the meaning of courage. Others claimed he walked among ruins where kings once stood, leaving behind only a single footprint in the ash. But none truly knew his name, nor the burden he carried within. Cale wandered across endless plains and silent forests, following no map, chasing no destination. He had once believed that the sword was his curse. Now, he understood it was also his anchor. Wherever he went, he found echoes of his past life, fragments of a world that refused to let him rest. There were times when he could almost hear the screams again, the sound of steel against steel, the weight of comrades falling beside him, the memory of a single mistake that had doomed an empire long forgotten. He had once been a general in another world, a warrior who sought glory above peace. His name then had been sung in fear and reverence. He remembered the day he raised his sword not to defend, but to destroy, and how the gods themselves had turned their eyes away from him. That was the life he had died in. That was the sin that bound his soul to the eternal cycle of rebirth. Now, in this world, he sought something he could never name: redemption, perhaps, or forgiveness. But forgiveness was for those who believed they deserved it, and Cale had long abandoned such illusions. He wandered north, where winter never ended. The land there was barren, wrapped in mist and snow. In the heart of that wilderness, he found remnants of an ancient battlefield, shattered banners frozen in ice, swords half buried in the frost, the ghosts of forgotten wars whispering in the wind. There, he felt it, the pull of something vast and old, something that had waited for him. He did not resist it. The storm began that night. Snow fell like ashes, and lightning tore the heavens open. Through the howling wind came a voice, not human, not mortal. It spoke not with words, but with presence. It was the same power he had felt before death, the same one that had judged him once. The god of war had found him again. In the blinding light, the world dissolved. When Cale opened his eyes, he was no longer among the living. He stood upon a sea of white fire, the air burning with divine heat. The sky was endless, filled with swords that floated like stars. Each blade pulsed faintly, as though alive. These were the memories of every warrior who had ever lived, the songs of the fallen, their stories carved into the heart of eternity. And before him stood a figure, colossal and formless, cloaked in flame and shadow. Its eyes were two suns, its voice a tremor that split the silence. It was not anger that emanated from it, but sorrow, the kind that only gods could carry. Cale understood without being told. The time had come. The god had summoned him not to punish, but to test. He drew his sword. The old, scarred blade that had survived both life and death gleamed faintly, as if recognizing its final purpose. When the god moved, the air itself screamed. The ground shattered beneath every step. Cale's body burned with pain, but he did not yield. Each strike he made was a prayer, each breath a confession. He remembered the faces of the fallen, the kingdoms he had destroyed, the student he had left behind, the girl who had once looked at him with both hatred and faith. The god's blows fell like meteors. Cale parried, stumbled, rose again. His arms trembled, his blood turned to fire, but still he fought. He knew he could not win. He was mortal, and the god was eternal. But the battle was never about victory, it was about worth. The god's voice filled the void. It was not speech but judgment, a vibration that struck the soul. It demanded to know what he sought. Cale's answer was not spoken, but felt, the will to protect, the memory of his student's courage, the light that she carried forward when his own had faded. He no longer fought for himself. He fought to prove that even the broken could create something pure. The god paused. For a moment, the storm ceased. Cale stood bleeding, shaking, his sword shattered to half its length. He fell to one knee, surrounded by fragments of light. Then, slowly, the god lowered its flame. The white fire around them dimmed, and the sea of swords began to hum, not in mourning, but in reverence. In that silence, Cale understood. Redemption was not granted by the divine. It was earned through the lives one touched, through the strength passed from hand to hand. His student had carried his teachings forward, turning his curse into hope. That was enough. The god's form dissolved into 1,000 glowing embers, scattering into the void. The last thing Cale felt was warmth, not the heat of battle, but peace. His body faded like dust into wind. When he opened his eyes again, the sky was blue. He stood on a hill overlooking Oldoria. The years had changed everything. The walls were rebuilt, the banners now bore a new crest, a phoenix intertwined with a blade. The city was alive with laughter and light. In the center square stood a statue of Queen Elise, cast in silver, her sword held aloft. At her feet, carved into the stone, were words that made Cale's breath falter, to the teacher who gave me a blade and taught me to wield my heart. He smiled then, quietly, almost sadly. No one around could see him. He was a shadow now, a remnant between worlds. The people passed by without noticing. Children played at the base of the statue, swinging wooden swords and shouting her name. For the first time, Cale felt lightness. The burden he had carried for lifetimes lifted from his shoulders like mist before dawn. He had not lived in vain. He turned his gaze to the horizon, where the mountains met the sky. There, beyond the mortal world, he could feel them, the echoes of warriors yet unborn, the souls waiting for guidance. His journey was not truly over. It would never be over. But the pain was gone. What remained was purpose. As the sun began to set, the wind stirred gently, carrying with it the faintest whisper, a voice that belonged to no one and everyone at once. A blade is not forged in fire, but in purpose. The wind moved across the city, through its streets and towers, into the training grounds where young knights practiced their forms. Among them, a girl barely older than 10 paused, her sword trembling in her hands. For a moment, she felt something, a warmth, a presence, and she looked to the horizon, eyes bright with wonder. The spark within her was the same he had once seen in Elise, the same light that refused to die even when the world drowned in darkness. He knew then that his role was to watch, to wait, to whisper when the time was right. He was no longer the man who sought redemption. He was the memory of the sword itself. The years would turn again. Kingdoms would rise and fall, and every age would call for warriors to protect what was precious. When that call came, he would answer, not as Kale, not as a man, but as the spirit of the blade. And so, as night descended and the first stars began to shimmer, he stepped forward into the fading light, leaving no shadow behind. Only the sound of the wind remained, steady, soft, eternal, carrying his final truth through the world that had once broken him and now remembered him in silence. No monument could hold his name, no song could capture his path. But somewhere, in every clash of swords, in every heartbeat before battle, his presence endured, the whisper of a man who had lived and died 1,000 times to teach one lesson, that the true edge of the sword is not forged in blood, but in love. And when the last warrior falls, when the last kingdom turns to dust, the wind will still carry his voice, faint, endless, eternal, saying softly to the next soul who dares to lift the blade, protect, even when it hurts. Fight, even when you are forgotten. For the heart that wields the sword is the only thing that never truly dies.